In a world devastated by decay and death, few could imagine anything worse than the relentless plague of the undead. The walking dead, rotting corpses animated by some unknown virus, have overrun the cities, towns, and countryside, tearing apart the last remnants of civilization. Survivors are scattered, hopelessly clinging to fractured communities, guns, and dreams of sanctuary. Yet, even in this horrifying new world, something worse lurks in the shadows. From the black reaches of the void, they arrive, Xenomorphs. Born of nightmare and forged by evolutionary perfection, these extraterrestrial hunters know no fear, no remorse, and no mercy. When these two apex predators collide, only chaos and carnage can follow. It began quietly, as apocalyptic horrors often do. A fireball streaked across the night sky, crashing in the dense woodlands of Virginia. Survivors in the nearby safe zone noticed the tremor, but dismissed it as an old satellite falling from orbit, another remnant of the lost world. However, what emerged from that crash site would soon make the walkers seem almost benign. A scout ship, damaged and corrupted by years in deep space, carried a deadly passenger. Locked in containment was a single xenomorph egg, still alive and fertile. The ship's crash had ruptured the containment unit, and the warm environment of the forest made the perfect breeding ground. When an unlucky scavenger named Mike found the wreckage, curiosity got the better of him. By the time his screams echoed through the forest, it was already too late. The facehugger that latched onto Mike did what it was designed to do, impregnate. The gestation period was swift, violent, and as the chestburster tore its way into the world, it took its first deep breath of air on Earth. But Earth was no longer teeming with vibrant life. Instead, it was littered with corpses, walking and otherwise. Still, the xenomorph adapted. It matured within hours, slipping into the surrounding area unnoticed. It hunted silently, avoiding both the living and the dead until it was strong enough to expand. With Mike gone, and no one returning to the crash site, the danger was allowed to evolve unchecked. Meanwhile, the survivors continued their struggle. Rick Grimes and his group had recently moved into a fortified compound. They'd dealt with Negan, with the governor, with countless betrayals, and more walkers than any sane mind could endure. They believed they had seen every kind of monster. But when one of their scouts, Daryl Dixon, returned with a story of a mangled walker covered in acid burns, they were forced to reconsider. At first, they thought it was some new mutation, a virus twist. But the burn patterns were unnatural, the wounds surgical and cruel. Walkers with their heads split cleanly open, torsos punctured from behind, brains missing. Something was stalking the dead and the living alike. Carol led a small team to investigate, hoping to find the source. What they found instead was a nest. Deep in a ruined warehouse were walls covered in a dark, resinous material, some organic compound unlike anything they'd ever seen. Bodies were cocooned into the walls, some still alive, others long dead. As they tried to understand the horror before them, movement in the shadows turned their confusion into panic. The xenomorph struck fast, its scythe-like tail skewering one of the group. It was sleek, black, and faster than anything they had ever faced. They opened fire, but the creature's blood sprayed like acid, burning through a concrete pillar and melting a steel beam nearby. The survivors fled, but not all of them made it out. By the time Carol reported back, the message was clear. There was something new in the apocalypse, and it was not from this world. Rick, trying to maintain order, had little time to prepare for what followed. More sightings, more attacks. The xenomorph was reproducing. Somehow, it had begun using both walkers and humans as hosts. The terrifying part? When walkers were impregnated, the resulting xenomorphs retained something of the undead's resilience. They were slower, but impossible to kill by traditional means. Shooting them in the head did nothing. Dismemberment only delayed them. Acid still coursed through their veins, and they could still climb, stalk, and kill. The group now faced two enemies, one relentless but predictable, the other stealthy, intelligent, and infinitely more deadly. The balance of power shifted rapidly. Areas previously cleared of walkers became battlegrounds, torn between hordes of the dead and swift, deadly Xenos. And as the body count rose, so did the xenomorph population. Their hive grew, spreading underground, beneath cities, and through subway tunnels. And they were adapting. Xenomorphs spawned from walkers carried fragments of necrotic decay, making them more difficult to detect by scent. Those born from humans displayed cunning, learning survivor patterns, testing barricades, mimicking sounds. Even Negan, always boastful and sure, admitted that he was scared out of his mind. At the heart of the conflict, a horrifying truth emerged. The xenomorph queen had arrived. Whether from the ship or evolved on Earth, no one knew for sure. But scouts returned with stories of a creature so massive it could only be described as demonic. Taller than a building, protected by her guards, she birthed dozens of eggs daily. Some survivors argued to move, run far, abandon the region. But Rick knew better. You don't run from something like this. You stand, or you die exhausted. Plans were made. Traps were laid. They lured walkers into xenomorph territory, hoping the two creatures would destroy each other. At first it worked. Swarms of walkers stumbled into nests and were decimated. But then, the Xenos stopped attacking. They started capturing, observing, using the walkers as shields. Some were even herded like cattle, pushed forward into human defenses to soften them up before the Xenos struck from behind. The survivors had taught the monsters strategy. Inside the hive, strange hybrids began to form. Not just walker-born Xenos, but creatures with reanimated traits, moving even after losing limbs, shrugging off explosives. The Queen was experimenting, using the walker virus to create something beyond death and evolution. A new species of apex predator, one that could survive anything. Survivor groups began to fall apart. Communities once thriving now lay in silence. Alexandria, Hilltop, and the kingdom tried to hold out, but one by one, they were overrun. The fear was no longer of being bitten. It was of being taken, cocooned, used. Maggie led a rebellion, using a stolen fuel truck to burn down a hive node. It worked for a while. The fire destroyed dozens of xenomorphs and gave hope to the fighters. But the cost was high, and the Queen responded with fury. Acid rained from above, killing horses, burning crops, and turning the very air toxic. The survivors retreated into underground tunnels, barely holding on. As the war dragged into its third month, strange patterns began to emerge. Some walkers were avoiding the Xenos entirely. Others were being ignored. Michonne hypothesized that xenomorphs only took healthy hosts. They didn't want contaminated ones. So the team developed a plan: coat themselves in walker blood to mask their scent and confuse the aliens. It worked, but only partially. The moment they made a sound, the Xenos adapted again. Sound triggered the hunt. Silence was safety. Rick, Michonne, and Daryl formed a final strike team. Their goal: take down the Queen. Armed with salvaged explosives, they tunneled under one of the major hives. Reaching the Queen's chamber was like entering hell. Cocoon bodies twitched in agony. Eggs pulsed with life. The Queen loomed above, sensing their presence. A battle ensued. The Queen's guards attacked first, Praetorians, larger and deadlier than standard drones. The survivors fought hard, losing half their team, but managed to plant the charges. As the countdown began, Rick looked back. The Queen was injured but still alive, crawling toward them with impossible fury. Daryl shot her in the face, buying them seconds. They escaped through the tunnels just as the explosion consumed the hive in fire and steel. The ground trembled. Acid and flesh exploded. The Queen screamed, and then there was silence. The aftermath was not peace, but it was a beginning. The loss was immense, but the Queen was gone. With her death, the hive mind fractured. Xenomorphs turned erratic, attacking each other, hunting aimlessly. The balance shifted again. Walkers still roamed. Survivors still feared the night. But the tide had turned. For now. Because in the blackened sky, among the stars, more ships moved. And Earth was still very much on the map.
The explosion that ended the Queen brought a temporary calm to the blood-soaked Earth. Smoke rose from the shattered hive, and charred remains of xenomorphs littered the once thriving nest. The survivors who had made it back alive stood in stunned silence, unsure if they had witnessed victory or merely delayed the inevitable. Rick, bruised and bleeding, stared out over the ruined land, gripping his rifle like it was the last thing keeping him grounded in reality. For a brief moment, they had hope. But hope was fleeting. Without the Queen's guidance, the Xenomorphs became unstable. Some tore each other apart, their instincts confused and unshackled. Others fled into the shadows, feral and dangerous, no longer bound by purpose. This unpredictability made them even harder to track, harder to kill. At least with the hive intact, their movements were organized. Now, they were everywhere, and nowhere. It was like fighting ghosts. Meanwhile, the walkers continued their slow, endless march. They had not noticed the change. They did not care. They only followed their hunger. And in some parts of the wasteland, something worse was happening. Hybrid xenomorphs, those born from reanimated corpses, were not completely gone. Some survived the blast, severely injured, mutated beyond recognition. They crawled through the rubble, screeching and leaking acidic blood, driven not by a queen's will but by some twisted instinct. Their minds were fractured, but their rage was intact. Maggie, now leading the scattered remnants of Hilltop, took charge of rebuilding. Supplies were short, morale was lower, but the survivors were hardened. They had seen two nightmares clash and lived to tell the tale. Children had grown up in the war. Babies had been born in bunkers, never having seen the sky. Rebuilding meant more than walls, it meant purpose. However, unknown to those on the surface, deep within the earth, another kind of rebirth was underway. One of the Queen's royal eggs had survived, buried beneath concrete and ash. The heat of the explosion had not killed it, only accelerated its evolution. The embryo within was not normal. It was smarter, faster growing, and carried traces of something alien and human. A facehugger emerged weeks later, driven by instinct, crawling through darkness until it found its host, an unfortunate scavenger named Jules. Unlike Mike before him, Jules did not scream. The infection process had grown more efficient. Within hours, a new kind of xenomorph was born, and it was unlike anything Earth had ever seen. This new breed stood taller than its predecessors. Its frame was more upright, with longer limbs and human-like eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It retained the acidic blood and inner jaw, but its skin was partially translucent. Beneath the surface, its organs pulsed with green light. It didn't hunt for food. It hunted for purpose. It was the new alpha. It didn't build a hive. It didn't need one. Instead, it sought control. It stalked walker herds, driving them like sheepdogs. It found feral xenomorphs and killed the weak, forcing the strong to submit. It learned human tactics by watching from a distance, understanding weapon formations, listening to radio chatter from scavenged walkie-talkies. It was not just a monster, it was a commander. Back in the survivor camps, Rick had taken to patrols again. He no longer gave speeches. He was a man worn down by too many battles. He missed Carl. He missed peace. He feared the silence more than the noise. And that silence was growing. Reports started coming in, walker herds behaving strangely, moving in unison, avoiding traps they would normally fall into. Then came the first ambush. A supply convoy was hit outside of what used to be Atlanta. At first, they thought it was a walker swarm. But when they reviewed the aftermath, it was clear, humans had not only been torn apart, they'd been dissected.
Skin flayed precisely. Skulls crushed surgically. Not for food, not for instinct. For study. Something had been learning from them. Daryl and Michonne took a scouting team to investigate. They found no survivors, only strange markings etched into trees, spiral-like, symmetrical, almost tribal. Beneath a burned-out vehicle was the half-melted corpse of a xenomorph, but different. Its inner jaw had barbs. Its blood was purple. When they burned the body, it released a cloud of spores that made two of the team collapse. They recovered, but were never the same, plagued by nightmares and hallucinations of alien worlds and cold, sterile machines. Then came the transmission. Crackling through every survivor radio frequency, a single voice, distorted, almost human, said, "We are not done." It repeated the phrase 3 times, then went silent. Everyone who heard it knew the war hadn't ended. It had only evolved. The survivors began preparing for another siege. This time, they weren't just facing mindless monsters. They were facing a mind, one that had learned from everything it had encountered. Fences were reinforced. Patrols doubled. Scouts trained in silence and stealth. Every survivor carried flares and makeshift flame weapons, one of the only reliable ways to slow a xenomorph. Yet, even with their precautions, the attacks resumed. Silent killings in the night. Children taken from beds. Defenders found with acid burns in their lungs, as if something had sprayed them during sleep. The new Alpha didn't just want to kill, it wanted to erase. Desperate, Rick sent a call for help to any remaining military installations. One response came. A deep space observation station had picked up signs of another inbound ship. It was massive, heavily armed, and bore the insignia of the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. The survivors didn't know what that meant, but Michonne did. She'd read books in the old world. She knew they were the ones responsible for the xenomorphs' existence. They wanted to weaponize them. Sure enough, the ship landed weeks later. Soldiers in advanced armor arrived, claiming they were here to help. They brought flamethrowers, drones, sonic emitters. For a short time, it seemed the tide could turn. But Rick didn't trust them. Neither did Maggie. And they were right not to. The corporation had no intention of wiping out the xenomorphs. They wanted samples. They wanted control. The soldiers were only there to protect the scientists. And when the new Alpha attacked their forward base, it did not flee. It stood in the flames and screamed, its body adapting to the heat, its blood thicker and slower. It killed every soldier except one, who it infected and sent back, with a message carved into his chest. "We evolve." Rick knew what had to be done. They couldn't rely on anyone else. It would be them or extinction. So he gathered every leader left, Maggie, Daryl, Michonne, Aaron, even Negan. They laid out the final plan. They would draw the Alpha out. They would use the last clean nuclear reactor at an abandoned energy facility to lure it, and they would bury it in radioactive fire. It took weeks to organize. Dozens died just securing the area. But in the end, they did it. The Alpha came, slowly, confidently, its hybrids following. It walked through fire. It tore apart defenses. It reached the core, and then Rick pressed the detonator. The blast was unlike anything the survivors had seen. A mushroom cloud rose into the sky, visible for hundreds of miles. The ground quaked. Buildings crumbled. Radiation poured into the earth. No one spoke for a long time. Silence again. But no transmission followed. No glowing eyes in the dark. The Alpha was gone. Or so they hoped. Months passed. Rebuilding began anew. Crops grew. Walker herds thinned. Children laughed again. But far away, in the dark void of space, another ship received a signal. A simple message, coordinates, and a single word: Earth.